Eu não encontrei uma.
Que era, sabe, os Nice Road?
Sei.
E a Júlia? Tá bem? A Júlia?
Está lançando o livro dela, está lançando o filme dela em streaming hoje.
Olha.
Por isso que ela não veio.
Mas demoliram agora, porque 10 anos atrás não.
Uns 5 anos.
Tá isso, Pô, você morei numa cidade chamada Oscar, também que é super. Deixa de demolir.
Também não é? Aí quando você volta, você tem decepção.
Os cartões da Telegráfica, quase todos fechados.
Correio de Rio.
Todos foram embora. Só ficou lá hoje em dia.
Hoje em dia?
Bom, há 10 anos atrás. Né? Quando eu saí de lá, eu fiz uma aula meu que eu falava assim, cara, você foi lá para o lugar, bicho, eu rápido também.
A última vez que eu fui com meus filhos, fui para o Colorado, esquiar e depois e tinha. Sabe quando você fica ansioso para mostrar o negócio? Chega não tem mais. Aí meu filho, que é sacana, ele fala, tão legal que fechou, né, pai?
Fechou de esse, né? Porque é vontade dele. Acho que inverno vem mais sente mais calor. No verão isso não tem, não consegue estabelecer uma coisa do tipo se você coloca 20 graus. Tinha um pessoal peixe baixo, peixe low, peixe baixo.
Só peixe novo.
Bom, o ficha está mais ou menos, né? Depende do dia. Você conhece? Esse é o coordenador.
Ah, sim.
Isso.
All right. Good afternoon, everyone. So welcome to this extra session of the Brazil seminar. And it's a great pleasure for us to have a very distinguished guest. I don't think I have to introduce him to the Brazilians because he, especially for those of us who know a little bit of economic history of Brazil, Edmar Bacha is a well-known name. And I guess for an even broader audience, he's a household name that, especially for those of us who went through the years of hyperinflation, 80s, and saw the onset of the success of the Plano Real, and have been following the country the last few decades. Edmar Bacha has been one of the protagonists in having set economic policy in the country. We were just talking with some of the students here before, and I learned some interesting facts about Edmar. The first one is that he was the first PhD in economics in Brazil when he came to Yale, and he set up the stage for several generations that followed his footsteps. So he's in many ways the gene of successful groups that followed his example. Edmar was the president of the Brazilian Statistics Agency, and he can comment on that, on like how wonderful that experience was, in spite of some drawbacks that happened in that over that time. He was also the president of Brazilian Development Bank. And for those of you who are not familiar with Brazilian institutions, and just to give you an idea of magnitude of the importance of the BNDES, at some point in Brazil's history, the last couple of decades, the BNDES disbursed more than the World Bank and the IDB in loans combined. So can you imagine like the the importance of an organization like that for just one single country. And but here in the US, I would say that the name Bacha is probably more associated with someone else, in particular in the Colombia community. Some of you might have heard about Julia Bacha, award winning movie director. Edmar was just saying that Julia couldn't make it to today's event because she's launching a new movie on streaming. And for the Colombia community in particular, we are very proud to have Julia as a Columbia alum. And among other awards that she received, a few years ago, she was given, and let me quote here, the University Medal for Excellence, which is granted to distinguished alumni under the age of 45. So she was here having classes with Professor Albert Fischlo a few years ago. And hopefully some of you will also see her as a role model for your future career perspectives. So without further ado, let's hand over the podium to Professor and Dr. Edmar Bacha, who's going to be speaking about Brazil's economic history from a long-term perspective, something that in our classes that we tend to focus more on policy issues on the short term, and it's very refreshing to have this long-term view and revisit some of the data that has been collected over the years, and to what extent our perspective of the data has changed with this groundbreaking work that Edmar is presenting to us. So Edmar, thanks a lot for joining us once again.
Thank you very much, Sidney. It's a pleasure to be back here. This presentation it's called Secular Stagnation Followed by Near Miraculous Growth. And it's released in Brazil's national accounts from 1820 to 1980. I should explain how this came about. That I'm a member of the Brazilian Academy of Letters, and the also member there is a Brazilian historian, José Murilo Carvalho, and he organized a set of conferences last year to commemorate 200 years of Brazil's independence. And in one of these conferences, he asked me to prepare a presentation for a review of the Brazilian economy in this 200 years since independence in actually 1822. So that's what I endeavor to do. I decided to make it more seriously than was actually necessary for a simple presentation there. And I asked my good old friend, the illustrious economic historian Flávio Versiani, who is the professor of economics at the University of Brasilia, and a young economist from Paraná, Guilherme Tombolo, who had written a master's thesis in 2014, reviewing the national accounts of Brazil in the 19th century. And then I saw join with me and Versiani, and we try to review your review. That's basically the first paper. It's called Secular Stagnation, a new view on Brazil's growth in the 19th century. And it so happened, that for reasons that I probably can explain it right now, in the idea, actually, let me go to the presentation. In these papers, we dispute two consensus on Brazil's economic history since independence. The first historiographic consensus is that the Brazil's economy stagnated in the 19th century. It had nearly the same per capita GDP in $874 as either in 1820 or 1800, which was 1867, basically the same values beginning at the end of the century. And this is the data that appears. I don't know how many of you are familiar with that, with the Madison project database. This data, these dollars that I mentioned are dollars of 2011. This Madison project database, it continues the work of Angus Madison, who was an economic historian, who dedicated his life to calculate GDP per capita of all countries since Roman times, and especially, but particularly from the early 19th century. And today, if you enter this the Madison Project database, there is data there for every year for all countries in the world since at least the 1800. And this is considered a very serious work that most economic historians adopt as the basis of their studies. So this is one fact that it's in the historiography that we're going to dispute. The second one is that in the 20th century, up to 1980, Brazil's GDP growth rate was one of the fastest in the world, maybe losing only to Japan. And in fact, in 1980, according to the official data, Brazil's per capita GDP was nearly 13 times as high as in 1900, $7,000 versus 560, according to data in 2019 US dollars from IPEA data. IPEA data is something that Fisher founded way back in 1965. And is now the official source. Fisher, you have to stay somewhere in the back in order to see here. More, can you see it, Ruby?
Just over here. Over here.
So we're disputing these tools, historiographic, accepted facts, in one paper, in one the other, in the other one. So that's started with the where the facts come for the Madison project for Brazil in the 19th century. There is basically, these are the sources, for 1800 to 1850. What they quote, the Madison Project database, is this paper by Prados de la Escosura. But if you go in and read the paper by Prados de la Escosura, it says that he's simply quoting numbers that he got from this Nathaniel Leff book of 1982, Under Development in Brazil, which is an evaluation of Brazil's evolution from 1822 to 1947. So this Leff is fundamental source for the first part of the 19th century. The second part, the Madison Project, quotes Barrow and Ursua's paper of 2008. But if you go to Barrow's and Ursua paper, you see that they simply said that they are reproducing the data from Goldsmith, Raymond Goldsmith, the professor at Yale, actually from my days at Yale. He came to Brazil for 2 years and wrote this book, which is unfortunately available only in Portuguese. I tried to get hold of the English manuscript, but unfortunately, apparently it has been lost forever. And there is, which is very bad, because this is a very extraordinary piece of work. And there's only this translation. The translation is not very good. But that's what we have to go with. So we have, first consider the first part of the 19th century, and considering what Prados de la Escosura and Leff tells us about this. Prados de la Escosura says that his figures for stagnant Brazil in the 1850 period were suggested by Leff. And Leff estimated GDP growth based on the quantitative theory of money and ad hoc hypothesis on the velocity of money. And to get number in real terms, he used three price indexes, which are of dubious quality. I'm not going to enter into this. Well, Leff's general conclusion in his book was that income per capita seems to have risen at only a moderate pace in Brazil during the 19th century. And his favorite number is 0.1% per year for the whole of the 19th century. Surprising, Prados de la Escosura quoted this passage from Leff in support of his adoption of zero per capita growth in the first part of the 19th century, a hypothesis that was later incorporated in the Madison Project since 2013. The surprise, is stronger because a few pages later in his book, Leff attempted a possible periodization, as he said, of income growth in the 19th century, and found that, considering 5 sub-periods from 1822 to 1899, the growth of deflated currency stock was higher in the early part of the century than in its second half. So, we don't have, in Leff, any reason to believe that actually the first part of the 19th century was one of stagnation. But then, recently, there's this book by 3 Brazilian economic historians, Marcelo Abreu, Lago, and Vilela, that in Passos Lentos, which they recently published in small steps in the economic history of Brazil in the empire, they point out that the money stock series for the early 19th century were precarious, and instead they based their presumption of stagnated per capita GDP in the first half of the century on the evolution of exports. So you see, we are here dealing with very precarious sources. Very one, is the stock of money deflated by some price indexes, and the other is the evolution of exports in nominal terms, also deflated by some domestic price index. Well, my point here is that our point is that a recent revision of Brazil's official export series in the 19th century presents a divergent view from stagnated per capita exports in the first half. In Brazilian export growth and divergence in the tropics by Absel and Tena Junguito, a paper of 2016, they concluded that Brazil's export growth was more dynamic during the post-independence decades, that is from 1822, than in any other period in the 19th century. And according to them, from 1821 to 1850, Brazil's exports in British pounds grew 161% rather than the 62% shown in the official statistics used by Abreu, Lago, and Vilela. So, concluding this part, that Leff's possible periodization of real money stock growth and Absel and Tena Junguito's revision of Brazil's export statistics lead to the conclusion that based on these 2 variables, and it's only these 2 variables that had been considered in the previous literature, based on these 2 variables, the first half of the 19th century was certainly not one of stagnation, and this opened the space for what we're doing after we consider the second part of the century, which is as follows. The second part, as I say, is this book by Raymond Goldsmith. And in the absence of hard production data, Goldsmith first generated a proxy for yearly per capita GDP in current prices by averaging out 5 series. Export of goods, which are already seen, imports of goods, that's his new contribution, central government spending, also a new contribution of him, the money stock, which was already used in the past, and his own construction of a wage bill for the country. So he constructed this 5-yearly series, they averaged them out, and he obtained his estimate of yearly real per capita GDP by deflating this proxy, which is this average of this 5 series, by another average of 4 price indexes, 2 of them of dubious quality, about which I'm not going to talk either here. So the resulting real per capita GDP, as we are going to show in the following, makes little sense from what we know of Brazil's economic history in the period being 1850 to 900. Because according to Goldsmith, Brazil grew handsomely from 1850 to 1867, the first part of the period, but from then onwards, the trend growth rate of the country was negative, as seen here. This is the Goldsmith real per capita. It's a series with 1900 equal to 100 here. And as you can see, there is growth from 1850 up to 1867. And then there is a continuous decline, except for this strange period here about which we're talking later, in the rest of the century. And this is incongruous with what we know that, because in the later part of the century, first, slavery was being extinguished progressively from 1870 onwards. European migration was gaining strength, especially in the second part of the century. Coffee expansion in São Paulo was generating the incredible amount of new income in the country. And finally, railroads, a theme so dear to Fischl in the American past, was also finally making its appearance in the country and furthering its economic growth. So, it cannot be, given what we know of the second half of the century, that this is a real picture for the period, and we are going to show something what we did here. So, now we enter in our paper. We are building on this master thesis of Guilherme Tombo of 2013. We use Goldsmith's methodology for the entire 1920-1900 period with the following differences. First, we use new series that were not available to Goldsmith for export and imports, the Axel Antenna Junguito series that I previously mentioned, for government taxes and spending. Is a economic historian from Minas Gerais, just produced a book on government taxes and spending from the 19th century last year. Money supply, we have an updated version of the Pelaez and Suzigan series that Goldsmith used, and inflation, which is the new index by Catão that was only available after Goldsmith was gone. So, and rather than simply taking an average of this series, we use a weighted average of this series with the weights derived from the regression for the 1900-1947 period to obtain 19th century per capita GDP in current prices according to. So this weights here, 26 for exports, 12 for imports, 24 for an average of government spending and taxes, and 37 for money, are obtained from a regression of these same variables on GDP per capita for the 1900-1947 period. So, it makes a little more sense than simply taking a arithmetic average. And then we use the Catão index which was from 1992, book by Goldsmith from 85. We used the Catton Index to estimate inflation from 1870 to 1900. Unfortunately, Catton only published this data going back to 1870. So in order to reproduce the Catton Index for the previous period, we use two other indexes, one by Buesco, the other by Lobo, and we use for the 1820 to 1870 period the weighted average of these two indexes, where the weights are 72 for Buesco, 28 for the Lobo index. We call it the extended Catton Index. These weights were obtained in a regression of the student index on the Catton Index in the 1871-1887 period. So we try to be as good as we possibly be, with the data that are now currently available to us. And this is how we obtain our new series, which compare the following way with Goldsmith series previously available. So the dotted series here, the dotted series is the original Goldsmith series, going up until 67 and then down onwards. And here in this gray line, this is the Goldsmith series using as deflator, not the average of four price index that he used, but our deflator. So as you can see, and this is our series, the one, the black here, continuous black. And you can see, that if we deflate Goldsmith's data, monetary data, by our price index, we obtain a very similar series as ours, which indicate, that the problem with Goldsmith, as compared to our own work, is not so much in the monetary series, but it is in the price deflators. And we are pretty sure that we can demonstrate, and we do that in the paper, that our price deflators makes much more sense than the ones that Goldsmith used. So this is our new view for the 19th century, rather than stagnation. There is this is the original series. And we draw a trend line. This is a particular way of drawing a trend line, which I explain to you later if you want to. It's not a minimum squares. It's something that ignore outliers. And I was very eager to ignore these outliers here, because they really don't seem to belong to this series. There's something specific to the last decade of the century, which was very peculiar, as Fisher is going to explain to us later. And then, once you do that, and you adjust a trend, this same tail trend to it, you obtain a regression with a coefficient of 0.9, which says that all over the 19th century, both for the first part for the second part, our best estimate that we have for the growth of the economy is 0.9% per year, which is substantially more than what other research had in the past. So this is the novelty of the paper, and this is the figure that we would take. We do not pay much attention to the ups and downs here because, given our very rough methodology, we don't think that we should be preoccupied with particular points, but only with the general trend of the series. Now, And here's the general comparison. That, well, except for the last decade of 19th century, Brazil compares well with other Latin American countries and Europe. Here, this data, we have per capita GDP in the 800s, Brazil and other countries, in 2011 US dollars. And in brackets here, we have the trend values and growth rates. So what we have, the first part here are the dollar values of GDP per capita for 1820, 1850, 1890, 900. This is the value that you have in the Madison project for Brazil. This here is the value that you can calculate point to point in our numbers. And this is the values that we calculate from the trend rate in the back. This is the values that Madison has for other countries of Latin America, besides Brazil. This is the one of these figures they have is Madison figures for Western Europe, and this is the Madison figures for the United States. So basically, what you can see here, that you can see stagnation here in Madison overall. Well, let's look at his last number, his last figure here from 1820 to 1900. The growth rate of Brazil would be 0. According to our trend is 0.9, and according to our point-to-point estimate is 0.7, which does not compare too well, neither with Latin America. We've had one, Western Europe 0.9, and especially the United States that had 1.4 over the century. But if you omit the last decade and concentrate it in the period up to 1890, ignoring that peculiar behavior in the last century, in the last decade, the cumulative growth rate for Madison was 0.3, for us was 0.9, which is the same as other Latin American, not very, even larger than what have Eastern Europe, and only is losing to the United States, the United States exceptionalism. So, what this historiography will tell you, is that Brazil was exceptional in the opposite way that the United States was exceptional in the 19th century. So that the United States grew exceptionally high and Brazil stagnated, whereas both Europe and Latin America progressed at a rate closest to 1% per year. What you're saying here, forget it, there's only one exceptionalism. The exceptionalism is what the United States did in the 19th century, and Brazil actually behaved more or less the same as other Latin American and Western Europe, and there is a whole chapter in our written by Flavio Reciani on our paper that try to justify, from historiographical facts that our figures make sense. So this is the 19th century. But then there's this mysterious question, perhaps those that are coming first here to Brazilian history and listen to me, you're going to ask, but how come, what you're telling us, it makes so much sense. Why did the historiography accept for so long up to now? I hope not from here onwards, that Brazil stagnated in 19th century. Well, for me, there are three possible explanations. The first is the authority argument. Professors and students should not accept authority argument, right? But as you can see in the literature, most people said, oh, Madison said that, so I'm going to follow what is there in their numbers. So it's the Madison project that said that Brazil stagnated, so Brazil stagnated. This is 1/3 of the reason. The other third is that you see how come, Brazil suffered from three evils, It was an anti-business monarchy. For those who are more familiar with Brazil, there is a lots of mythological stories about how our emperor Don Peter II didn't allow the great entrepreneur of the 19th century, Mauá, to progress. So one is that the monarchy didn't allow the business to develop in Brazil. The second is that Brazil was a slave-based country. So how can everyone knows that slavery is unproductive. And finally, there's the natural resource course. We know that only with industrialization countries can grow. And how come Brazil could have grown if it didn't industrialize and only had coffee to go for it for most part of the century? So all this together, is part of the ideology, that justify the stagnation. And first, and perhaps more important, the second fact, if Brazil actually grew in the 20th century as fast as the official statistics say, we are still a middle-income country. But if we grew that fast, which this means that in the early 20th century, Brazil had a very low per capita income. And in fact, the per capita income in Brazil was very close to what the Madison Project uses as subsistence, with $700. And according to the official figures, the ones that use in Madison, in the early 20th century, we had a per capita income of only $874, which was very close to 700. So, Brazil couldn't have grown very much in the 19th century because otherwise we do not exist in the 18th century, right? So in order I cannot do anything about this here, right? Except showing that we're doing better and we don't believe in this ideology. But here we now have to show, what we do about the 20th century. Well, let's try to show that Brazil did not grow as fast as these official statistics has it. And this is the second paper, about which I'm going to have only one page for you, in order because there's some time for the discussion. And his second paper re-estimates the Brazil GDP growth in the 1900 to 1980 period, very briefly here. So let's go to the facts. Brazil's national accounts, official national accounts, they start in 1947. And from 1997 to 1980, they were calculated by the Vargas Foundation. In his 1974 PhD thesis for Chicago, Cláudia Dá applied the Vargas Foundation methodology to estimate Brazil GDP from 1900 to 1947. And to date, these are the official figures for Brazil GDP in the 1900 to 1980 period, as per IPEA data previously mentioned. Well, the problem with this data is that they exclude low growth services, assuming implicitly that they grew as fast as the fast growing sectors which are in the account. The excluded services from these numbers represent 30% of GDP in the Vargas Foundation data, and they are government, rentals, and a whole bunch of other services, and 20% of GDP in Haddad's data, which is rentals and other services. What happens is that data that we have available for 1947, 1966, and then for 1980 from 1990, when these services were re-included in the services, there was an old series in which these services were included. And then after 18, they were re-included by IBGE, by the Statistical Institute, to replace it by the foundation in the calculation of national accounts. So the data for 1947, 1960, 1980 to 1990 show that the excluded services grew only slightly more than population and much less than computed GDP. What we did in the paper was to add estimates of the excluded services growth to the official national accounts for selected periods from 19 to 1980. For example, for the 1947-96 period, the new GDP growth estimate is, the new growth rate is 0.7 of the old GDP growth, plus 0.3 of the growth rate of service, 0.3 being the percentage of services in the total GDP that we know of. So, this is something like 8%, right? This is something like 2 to 3%. And so our average is always lower than the official figures show. And the final results that we obtained without much discussion is as follows, let's consider here the 1900 to 1980 period. According to GDP, according to IPEA data, Brazil grew 5.7, extraordinary rate for 80 years per year, the GDP. And according to us, it was a lower, much lower 4.9%. And particularly here, let's go back to here, the so-called miracle period, 1960 to 1980, where Brazil would have grown 8.6%. When we put back the services in, the growth rate goes down to 7.1%. So there is the point is, as far as what we're discussing here is important for, in the official data for 1900 to 1980, the GDP per capita grew 3.3%, and according to our data, only 2.5%. So if we apply not 3.3 to the data for 1980, but 2.5, what we obtained for 1900, it's a much higher GDP rate than is currently the national accounts. So there is sufficient room for having the growth that we have in the 19th century, and this completes our work. And this is the last table that I'm going to show and then stop. So what is the Brazil's per capita GDP growth rates in the 19th century, in the 20th century? According to MDP, Madison or IPEA data, this was 0. According to us, or something between 0.7, 0.2 or 2.9, which is the trend. From 1900 to 1980, according to IPEA data, is 3.3. The GDP per capita, according to us, is 2.5. So, besides stagnation, there is a very substantial difference, or 3.3, and this is the origin of the title of this discussion, that Brazil was stagnated, and all of a sudden you started having this near miraculous growth rate of per capita income of 3.3 for 8 years, and with the difference between them of 3.3. When we do our calculations for Brazil, this difference, is reduced to 1/2 of what history up to now tells us that it was. That's it. Thank you.
Yeah. Thanks so much, Edmar. And we're very fortunate today to have here with us Professor Albert Fischlo, Professor Emeritus Albert Fischlo, who, as we all know, was the founder of the Center for Brazilian Studies. But in his earlier days as an academic, he was one of the pioneers of this, on the use of quantitative methods to study economic history, a field that's called cliometrics. So Professor Fischlo, in many ways, Edmar Bacha's paper is a reflection of your own trajectory as an academic, and would you like to share some thoughts and reactions to the presentation?
Yes, I would. In the first place, I want to credit Edmar with destroying Madison and Goldsmith. In earlier work, I had actually used Goldsmith and destroyed him as well. So there's some similarity in our efforts. I went back in the case of Brazil in a paper that I published on import substitution in Brazil. And I also went back to original data that were available on the government sector, and in particular external investment, which was a central part of the whole experience. And it seems to me that as brilliant as this paper is, or the two papers, what you leave out is the need to talk about the cyclical process and the importance of Brazil in receiving foreign investment and then canceling the foreign investment, stopped coming when Brazil ran into a balance of payments problem, and that led to an increase in the Brazilian debt. So you had the increase in the Brazilian debt, which Marcelo talks about a great deal in the work that he has done. And if you look at what happens there, and particularly trying to look at the cycle in sugar production, which occurs in the 1800s as part of the process, and then look at the conversion not to coffee, but to what was the cotton, thank you, which was associated with the decline in the production in the United States as a result of the Civil War. And then if you look at the rise of coffee as a major source of production, in which you initially had important migration of the slave population from the Northeast to Sao Paulo at that particular time, as well as the large movement from the population in Europe, as you had the Portuguese population moving, and earlier you had the German population going to Rio Grande do Sul, and you've got a process in which it's the cycles that ultimately count. And this attempt to have a trend line, as attractive as it is, and it is an incorrect analysis. I've tried to deal with what went on in Brazil in the cycle in the 1930s, and also the textile cycle, which after the cotton production became available, became a source that was absent earlier and became an important input into industry, as the work of Stein shows that he had done earlier. So, in spite of the brilliance of the piece, I think there is more to do. And rather than giving up, I think the point is to start with some of your new numbers. I also have a series in which I try to make estimates using some of the data and looking at real exports as an important component of what output was. So I think our next piece might be joint, and it might lead to new variability and become an accepted series at last that everyone must use.
Thanks so much, Professor Fischler.
Thank you very much. No, I would love it to do. After all this year, you only did one paper together, you know, so it's about time that we do a second one. Yes, and you're definitely right, you know. We didn't feel comfortable, you know, given the fragility of our procedures, you know, to look at cyclical process. You know, I was tempted, you know, but then I decided, you know, it was taking too far, you know, the numbers that we have to look at not only at the trends, but at also the cyclical process. There is a very interesting cyclical process. I did it for myself, you know, but I decided not to publish it for the time being. But with your signature in it, you know, we probably can do it.
Excellent. So by the way, we stopping the transmission at 1 o'clock, but then we're going to continue conversation, closed doors, Chatham House rules. So you're more than welcome to stay around. And we know that some students have classes after. So we have a 1 minute break in between the two parts. But before we kick off the debate, Edmar, I think one of the great values of those two papers, apart from coming up with a more accurate estimate of economic growth, it's also to help us reflect on the change that the country went through in those 2 centuries. And the way that you divide it in those 2 periods, it looks like at first, from a first view, that there was a paradigm shift between how Brazil was in the 19th century and what Brazil became in the 20th century, right? In the language that our students probably understand better, there was an upgrade in operating system, and Brazil in many ways took off, at least until 1980, right? So what are the insights that we could gather out of this contribution?
We know when Fisher was a young man, the topic, the idea of economic growth in the United States that was available was by a name called Walt Rostow. And who had written a very influential book called The Stages of Economic Growth. And the stage of economic growth was characterized by something that was the takeoff. And the takeoff, it's very congruent with this traditional view on Brazil, that Brazil was stagnant for a long period, but something we're accumulating out there somehow. And then all of a sudden, when all the stars converge, then there is a takeoff, and the country grows. Well, Fischler, in a sense, by looking specifically at the railroads, destroyed this conception. Right? So this part here, is basically saying, that besides this takeoff ideology view, there is this conception, that there were the 19th century was stagnant because the crown was anti-business. This is incorrect. Mauá is a myth. The second is that the anti-slavery could not grow because of its own nature, and we know from the works on slavery, in this country here, that pre-bellum, the South grew as fast as the rest of the country, right? Besides slavery, and third, this idea that only industry may make a country grow, and that export led from natural products cannot possibly lead to growth, So in a sense, not saying this specifically, but what we want to show is that, well, these are all myths, and in fact, there was growth, despite of, or, as part of this process of the 19th century. And besides, when you look at the industrialization period, mind you, at least part of it, not all of it, because the growth was still substantial, right? Was due to a statistical construct that the Vargas Foundation decided to do in 1968, right before the miracle, right? By a coincidence, by taking out these low-growing services from the national accounts and then producing this beautiful series that we now show here, that it's very particularly for the so-called miracle period are substantially less than what the statistics show. So there is this revisionist approach, but our papers are now under referee process in different journals, in 2 different journals. So let's see, how they come about after this view from the referees.
Yeah, and another story that Edmar showed, and also a testament to Professor Fischler's visionary reflection on Brazil's inequality over especially during the miracle times, right? It is the fact that when you see numbers per capita compared to the overall figures, there's a gap. And so, to what extent we can draw conclusions that the country grew more than we expected in the 19th century, less than official numbers estimated. But at the same time, when we see figures on a per capita level, still there's this gap that has to be explained.
Yeah, well, we didn't do anything new with the per capita figures, Right. Our new estimates are all on GDP. For the population, we use the basically same series that was previously available with only a small difference, so that whatever we say for GDP, indifferent from the rest, is equally valid for the GDP per capita.
Perfect. So, Professor Fischler, before we open up for discussions, any reactions to Edmar's comments?
Well, I'm absolutely, totally delighted at his willingness to accept the challenge of making the data more meaningful and more useful as a way of understanding what happened in this 19th century and in the early 20th century, with the attempt after the Ensigliamento to change as Brazil moved away from the Portuguese possession of what seemed to be the monarchy and came to be a republic for the first time. And there you really see the rise of labor unions and the way in which they react and their importance in this whole cyclical process, which went on in a very big way until the 1920s, when Brazil received a very large quantity of loans from the outside. But this is delightful.
Thanks so much. All right, so we're stopping the transmission right now, Camila, and we have 30 seconds if you